Well, I have a lot to talk about today. I'm so excited. This is one of my favorite topics to support parents in making their own choices in alignment with their values around what provider they really feel is best for them. There are so many different providers out there with different philosophies, different models of care, and different settings all offer you a completely different experience. So it is common in the West to get pregnant and then you go to your OB and then you have a hospital birth. And that's just what like the culture steers people towards. And there's nothing at all that's wrong with that. But what I really want to support all parents in is making a choice that really feels best for them, depending on or really based on their own philosophy, their preferences, and their wishes for their birth, because the hospital environment is not the best environment for everyone. It is a great environment for lots of people, but home and birth center, like out of hospital birth, are great environments for other people. And there are a lot of different factors to consider when making this decision, and it is a really big decision. So we have a lot of research and evidence that shows that your chosen provider significantly impacts your risk for tearing, your risk for cesarean, and other interventions. So the provider has such a huge impact on the outcome, the likelihood of you even having a vaginal birth, the likelihood that you were able to avoid tearing, and that's huge. So it's really important that we, instead of just follow along like the normal path, make our own informed choices and be assessing for alignment throughout the whole time. Because you can choose, for example, to have a midwife or to have a certain provider and feel like, great, I feel great about the fact that I'm birthing in this location. I like my provider. But if we decide I like my provider, they're perfect, and I'm going to release the responsibility of continuing to assess for alignment, what can happen is a misalignment comes up and we deny ourselves seeing that truth because we are so committed to believing that this provider is a good person for us. It can be hard when we've categorized someone in our mind or a location in our mind as being the right thing to like be assessing for alignment and then to be like, oh, this actually isn't really the best anymore. I'm not liking this midwife. I think I need a new one. It's not often that happens, but it's important that we are consistently assessing for alignment. And what that means is that we continue to feel good, right? Like after your appointment with your provider, when you leave, you want to feel relaxed. You want to feel like your questions were answered. If you're with your provider and you feel more afraid, you feel bullied, you feel anxious, overwhelmed, and you don't feel like you're getting good support, all of that can absolutely impact the way that you experience them in your birth, right? So looking for alignment is really, really important. So today we are talking about the difference between home birth and hospital birth. For home birth, I'm going to use the term sometimes out of hospital birth because some of the studies that I'm referring to and some of the other like pros and cons of midwife versus doctor, I'm talking about out of hospital midwives that are going to be assisting births at birth centers and at home. And so kind of like, all of that's going to be clumped over there. If that makes sense, both the home birth and the birth center births. Maybe I'll first start by sharing. And like I said before, there's no wrong choice. It's just about choosing what feels best for you. There is, a huge difference in the experience of birth and the way that birth unfolds in these different models of care. So the home birth environment and the out-of-hospital birth environment typically is supported in a different model of care than the hospital. It's not just that you're birthing at home, it's that you're birthing in a different model of care. Every care provider has a different model, and then within that model, their own unique philosophies and training and things that totally impact the way that they support you. So it's important to be aware of all that and know that every provider individually is different. I know obstetricians that provide breech, so vaginal birth support in homes, I interviewed one on my podcast, actually. It's called the Peaceful Birth Podcast. It's just a couple episodes down. It's a really good episode. There are also midwives who are very medicalized, and which means that they have a big emphasis on medical intervention in the way that they support their patients, and that they might even seem like more medicalized than an OB. So, there's variation in every care provider. But why I'm opening this up by talking about the models of care is because this is a really helpful way to help you identify what is going to be the best model for you by understanding the difference of the models. So, in a hospital setting, this is what the model of care typically looks like. I like to call it conveyor belt care, which means that when you're in that setting, if you're following along everything that they tell you to do, you're kind of following along an algorithm of policy. Your water broke within 24 hours, we start you on Pitocin. You have GBS, you get antibiotics. There's all these different things that we follow along on. Care recommendations are based on whatever the policy or the algorithm is for that specific institution. If you're in the hospital, that doesn't mean you have to automatically get conveyor belt care. You can create a personalized experience for yourself, but rarely is that handed to you. Instead, we have to do more advocacy in a hospital, typically compared to out of hospital. Learn about all the different options available, what the research has to say, and develop tools for advocating and making our own informed choices. And that can sometimes feel like you're swimming against the stream if you want to have a different kind of birth in that model of care, but it is absolutely possible. So, in that model of care, typically there's an emphasis on medicalization. So, providers are more comfortable being hands on. They are trained to be hands on, offering more interventions typically. Providers want to be touching your body and your baby when the baby comes out. We have some research that shows that when the mom is birthing on their back, that is the position that is most comfortable for providers in that model of care because they've been trained. So the research we have is about provider training, OB training in different positions. And we found that they're so much more comfortable supporting moms in being on their back because they have a better view. They can be hands on and do the things that they are trained to do, and their training is limited around birthing in other positions. Prenatal appointments are typically shorter, and there's an emphasis on just looking at the testing and the numbers and like the algorithm of things and kind of following along that. There is not a big emphasis on natural wellness, on your emotions, how you're feeling. There isn't a lot of connection or personalization because appointments are so short. That doesn't mean those providers don't care about those things or don't care about you, but in the way that they have to, work, they have to see a certain amount of people every day to keep their job because seeing many, many people will make the hospital more money. And so that leads me to this next piece on that model of care is that we do typically run into some profit orientation around the way that things are run. And this is something that is often outside of many providers' control because they're not really the ones who are making the rules. They just have to follow the rules, follow the policies, and practice within the scope that their bosses allow them to practice. It does create some limitation because it takes about 10 to 20 years for current research and evidence to make its way into policy. And so that means that a provider might want to give you all of your options for one thing. Perhaps your water broke before you go into labor, and that provider wants to tell you that you can wait up to 72 hours if you don't have GBS before going into labor because that's what the research and evidence has to say. This is an example. The policy says that they want you to start Pitocin and be in labor within 24 hours, even though that policy comes from the 1950s when providers weren't washing their hands in between caring for patients and delivering babies, which led to babies having high rates of infection and dying if the mother had been in labor for over 24 hours after the water had broken. So obviously that doesn't apply to today, but that policy is still in place in many hospitals, around the world and in the US. So a model of care does have that emphasis on policy and profit, and that absolutely can impact the care that you receive. One more thing, I did mention that there's a higher that's more medicalized, which means there's more use of interventions. But in addition to that, those providers and OBs that you'll see in that model of care, there are midwives in the hospital model of care that are typically more naturally minded, but they also have to follow the same policies. So they are still limited in what they can offer. It's an emphasis on looking for pathology and treating problems when they arise instead of supporting wellness and preventing problems from arising in the first place. And there's an emphasis on what can go wrong. A lot of parents report being in that model of care and saying that they often left their appointments feeling scared because all the conversation was around what could go wrong. That's because an OB's job is to look for what can go wrong and treat it if it were to arise. But this can be anxiety inducing for moms who are wanting to believe in their body, wanting to feel confident going into birth. They have a provider who's constantly kind of keeping this emphasis on what it is that can go wrong without any support for the mom and feeling confident that it's more likely that all the things are going to go right. So that is that model. The home birth out of hospital model varies depending on the midwife of your choosing. So there are nurse midwives and there are certified professional midwives in the US. In other parts in other parts of the world, the way that midwives are licensed is very different and it just really depends on where you are. Either way, getting a licensed midwife means that that midwife has to follow regulations and to be able to keep their license. And those regulations are often strict, safe, evidence based, and they're there to make sure that midwives are providing good quality care. And midwives do typically provide really good quality care. The reason why the midwifery model tends to give parents a better experience is because it is a personalized model. So in that model, midwives have an emphasis on natural remedies, on supporting wellness, and taking a holistic stance on where you are in your journey. So looking at how you're feeling emotionally, what your relationships are like, what your diet is like, and giving you support with nutrition, from the beginning, giving you a lot of education around how to take care of your baby in a way that's personalized to you. What's your postpartum plan? Giving you education to support you in feeling more comfortable in pregnancy. And every midwife is so different because they have more time at appointments typically. They offer much more personalized experience that is so much more connective. So you really build a relationship with the midwife. And this is an important part of that model of care because birthing out of the hospital requires trust and a relationship. In the hospital model, if you are just doing what you're told, any provider can come in and just tell you to get on your back and tell you to push or tell you to do this or that. And if you're just following along that conveyor belt model, it doesn't take any kind of relationship or connection for things to unfold the way that they want things to unfold. But in a home birth model, the midwife wants you to trust her to be able to support you, throughout your birth and keep you safe, and also to use her clinical judgment to be able to tell you when it's time to transfer if the need were to arise. And so if a midwife in a hospital birth were to say like the baby's heart rate is showing me that they're not happy and I think it'd be safer if we transfer, you have a relationship with that person, you trust that person, and so transfer goes well and can be smooth. And often midwives have relationships with EMS, they have relationships with the hospital, and hopefully in your area, the midwife and the hospital has a transfer plan to support a smooth transfer process because that is what really supports outcomes. It's having a smooth transfer process, and that takes trust and connection, and so that's why appointments are usually longer. Yeah, and midwives, when they are in that model of care and they're taking time with you, they offer a lot of special unique things that you might not get in a more medicalized model of care, in the hospital model, which is that they can be so like loving and really support you in processing emotions. I've supported so many moms as a student midwife, just like crying at appointments and like processing fear and like, working through some deeper stuff. Yeah. And my midwife would massage my body with a hot stone. And that was the thing that she did. She had the same hot stone for years and years. And what you got from her was like the appointment where we do like all the medical stuff and we'd check your vitals and we'd look at listen to baby and feel baby's position. And then after that, it's like, let's just like chat. And so I would lie down on my bed and she would like boil the stone and then she would massage my body, for a while. And it felt so good. She'd give me like 25 minutes of massage and we would just chat and connect. And I felt so cared for and I looked forward to my appointments with her. And I left my appointments feeling physically and emotionally better than how I felt going into them. And that kind of care is so valuable. It really changes your entire pregnancy and birth experience to have the care and companionship and connection of someone who really cares about you and is supporting you from a holistic perspective. There is a gap in the Western medical model. And I'm not here to say anything, I don't want to say anything bad about the Western medical model to make anyone feel afraid of it because it is absolutely needed. Higher medical intervention, the need for that is absolutely needed sometimes. And it is amazing that we have access to that model. And that model of care, because of the way that it was built, does not offer a lot of personalization and also does not offer a lot of emotional support or social support or connect people to resources and all that stuff. And so you can go in and you can get your physical care, maybe not even like nutrition support or like all the physical care, but like we're ruling out pathology and doing testing and maybe chatting a little bit about your birth, but that's kind of all we have time for. And that model in many ways, fails parents who are wanting to have wanting to like do the best that they can to be really healthy, wanting to learn everything they can about birth, and they continuously might go to these appointments and then leave feeling like I didn't really get my questions answered, or I feel a little more anxious now. They're not getting that emotional support. But culturally, we don't really have an emphasis on emotional support, or supporting the mom in their initiation into this new role in life, helping them like navigate the whole emotional landscape that comes with becoming a parent or having multiple children. So we're left to figure that out on our own. And in an isolated environment, if don't have a lot of family or community around you, it can feel really lonely. And midwives are so wonderful because they can fill that gap and support you in having that connection, going into your birth. And some studies on the impact of racism in medicine and how different models of care have different outcomes and experiences for people. And there was one study that showed that when the entire community was supported by midwives, and this is from evidence-based birth, providing personalized care in that midwifery model of care, they were able to completely eradicate negative consequences from racism in medicine in that community specifically. And that is because midwives offer that personalized care. Midwives are more likely to believe you if you are worried about something, because they have that connection with you. This is where, racism in medicine is a really big issue, especially in the West. So there's actually this like fundamental root of racism that has woven itself into the way that providers are taught in medical school. And we've found through research that the model where there is personalization and there's connection with that person and the provider, there's shared decision making, that kind of relationship supports parents in being listened to and respected, which reduces risks of having a negative outcome from racism in medicine, which is really interesting. So the next thing I want to talk about is why is there so much fear of birth, and why is there so much fear of the midwifery model of care if everything that I just told you illustrates that that model is an excellent model for a lot of reasons and that it can feel so much more supportive. So why is everyone terrified of it? The reason why is because before the 1900s, birth was primarily supported by family doctors, and they would go to your home and deliver babies in homes, and midwives. Midwives were in the country at that time in the US were indigenous midwives typically, or they were Black granny midwives, traveled as slaves and were attending births for not only slaves, but also for slave owners' wives. They brought with them all these different people from different parts of the world, or indigenous people here, had with them these traditions to support normal physiologic birth and help birth be safe. The use of herbs, the use of massage, the use of positions, all these different things to support a healthy, normal physiologic birth. And people had really good experiences generally with these models of care, where there were these traditions woven into place, where their spiritual beliefs were respected and supported, where there were all these different forms of support to help moms have positive and healthy birth experiences. And these providers, these midwives, were very, very skilled and very good at what they did. In the early 1900s, male doctors realized that birth was an untapped market, which means that we were not profiting in a big way off of birth because just family doctors and midwives were attending births around the whole country. So what they did was, create profiting hospitals specifically for birth, and worked to drive birthing families into those hospitals so they could make money off of them. And what they found is that people didn't want to go to the hospital because they loved their midwife and their family doctor. And that doctor delivered them when they were a baby and delivered all of their children. And you know what I mean? Like there was this relationship and community connection with those people. So we didn't want to, like, no one wanted to go to the hospital. So, in order to make the most money off of people giving birth, we have to convince them that their bodies are broken and they need something outside of themselves in order to do it. So, what they did was launch a very racist campaign to make everyone believe that midwives are dirty. Only the poor deliver with midwives. If you are like an upper class woman, it means you have money, like to birth at the hospital. So they worked to change the culture to make people believe that it's desirable to be at the hospital. You're dirty and poor if you are birthing at home. And then legal persecution started becoming a thing, and midwives started becoming persecuted for practicing as birth became more medicalized and more power went to profiting hospitals that wanted to do everything they can, that had a hand in legislation, that had a hand in politics, to care for as many families as they could and drive out the competition. In the early 1900s, when we started going to hospitals, women had really horrible experiences there in general, because they were not practicing in evidence-based ways, and it's so much better today. There was twilight sleep, putting women in cuffs and like leg straps that were made with sheep's wool so that they wouldn't have bruises from fighting against it and their husbands wouldn't be concerned. I won't go too much further into all of that, but basically, birthing in the hospital was something that became like really, really traumatic for a lot of moms. But we were told culturally that that was the safest place to give birth. So what happened was in the early 1900s, with this campaign to make moms feel really afraid of birth, in addition to everyone having really traumatic and horrible experiences, we created an entire culture where people are horrified of birth and believe that it's something to be really afraid of, and believe that the hospital is the only safe place to give birth. And the truth is that it is not. So this takes me to, what does the research have to say? So what the research says, unfortunately, is that for one, we can't do randomized controlled trials, which is like the gold standard for good quality research, on home birth versus hospital birth, because we can't randomly assign someone to birth in the hospital or birth at home. It's not very ethical, and people don't want, like, have their own preferences, right? They don't want to be assigned to one or the other because they're so different. So instead, we can only really look at observational studies. And a lot of people say, like, oh, in a observational study, um, right, like since it's for home birth, Home birth is where low risk women give birth. So if we're looking at the hospital, we're looking at a population. A lot of people are higher risk and they wouldn't even qualify for a home birth. And so, of course, there's going to be higher rates of interventions because they need those interventions. I'm talking about looking at observational studies that categorize families in a specific ways that makes them be low risk. So they meet the low risk category and it's the same for both in hospital and out of hospital, if that makes sense. So it's very interesting. What we have found with the many observational studies that are good quality that we have is that there is no difference if you are within 30 minutes of the hospital. There is no difference in the rate of newborn death, in the rate of outcomes for babies. There is no difference in the rate of in the outcomes for moms either, except if you're in the home birth group or out of hospital group, there is a lower risk for tearing, a lower risk for C-section, a higher rate of breastfeeding, lower risks for forceps and vacuum, and also lower risk of infection for both you and your baby being out of hospital. Mic drop. And so I'm not here to illustrate why you should birth at home or anything like that, because not everyone is a good fit for home birth. Some people do need the hospital. Some people feel safer in the hospital. I do want to just make it really clear that if you have fear around birth, around home birth, or you know people who do, it's probably because we live in a culture that has told us, for the reasons that I illustrated before, that birth out of hospital isn't safe and scary. But we know that comes from the early 1900s, and it isn't actually true. And what the current research has to say is that there are higher rates of, like I said, breastfeeding, higher satisfaction rates. So people have better experiences, more rates of their perineum being intact when they're birthing at home with a licensed midwife compared to birthing at the hospital. And being out of hospital as a low risk person with a licensed midwife within 30 minutes of the hospital does not increase your risk for death or poor outcomes for you or your baby. And the reason why this is safe is because midwives offer, first off, like I said, they're offering personalized care. So they're looking at you and your whole person. We found through research that personalized care improves outcomes. In addition to that, there are rules that they follow for monitoring. So there are like people who say that they're midwives and they're not. There are people who are trained, women who are trained through the Free Birth Society, which is a horrible, horrible organization that is responsible for the death of many families, many babies. And that's a whole nother thing I'm not going to talk about. But and it's not about free birth specifically, it's about the Free Birth Society specifically, who have trained midwives. And so, some people say, like, I got a midwife. This person says they're a midwife, but they're not a licensed midwife. So they actually haven't been trained or they're not following rules. If you have a licensed midwife, that midwife is trained and they have to keep their license and follow state regulations or whatever regulations that they have to follow depending on where they are in the world to keep their license. And those regulations mean that the midwife has to monitor you and your baby all throughout labor. So let's talk about, like, what if something goes wrong? So if you're in a home birth setting, you don't have an epidural, you don't have pitocin augmentation, you don't have IV opioids, you haven't been induced medically, you haven't been given cytotec or misoprostol. All of those medications increase certain risks. Not that they're anything to be scared about, they are needed sometimes, but they do increase risks. And so when we are giving birth in an environment where there are medications in our system, we need to have closer proximity to emergency C-section and to other kind of medical tools. So if you are having a normal physiologic birth at home and you don't have those medications in your system, it is safe for midwives to monitor you intermittently all throughout labor to clinically assess that you still are remaining low risk. And if something, for example, starts to happen with baby, if baby is suddenly not tolerating labor well, if without the presence of medications that can cause contractions to be more like intense, which can cause baby to be more stressed, or IV opioids, which can cause baby's heart rate to drop, right? Like all that stuff. Outside of the presence of that in a normal physiologic birth, if a baby is starting to not do super well during labor, what you can do is like notice it ahead of time with the monitoring and then transfer if you notice something like that is happening. And that is why intermittent monitoring with midwives is safe, because they're continuously assessing to make sure that baby's heart rate is doing well. Babies don't just go from like, I'm fine to I'm dying, or like something really bad is happening without the presence of those medications, unless there's like a really rare situation happening, like uterine rupture, which is more likely, even though so rare, after a cesarean, or placental abruption, which I've literally never seen or heard of in a home birth, and is more likely if you have medications like misoprostol in your system that increase the risk for that. With those things happening, there are other signs like bleeding, pain, change in your belly shape. There's all sorts of different signs that happen that midwives are trained to catch before it becomes an emergency. And the midwives that are well respected, that always talk about like being in collaboration with, are midwives that don't bring a shit show or like a mess into the hospital. They don't push the limit, because they're following the laws that they have to follow to keep their license in their monitoring, to make sure that you and your baby are staying safe and staying in a low risk category. And then they transfer you before an emergency happens. That is what a good and safe licensed midwife will do. If a baby is starting to show signs that they're not well in labor, they're not tolerating labor well for whatever reason, what they will do is they'll start to show you after a contraction in a deceleration. So if we just check the baby's heart rate in between a contraction, maybe it's good, but that's not how we really understand the signs that babies aren't doing well. What we would do is we would check the heart rate after a contraction is finishing. So at the very end of the contraction, because during the contraction, within the range of 110 to 160 of a normal heart rate, baby's heart rate will start to go down. And it's normal within the range for it to go down a little bit and come back up. If it goes down like really close to the 110, or like way below that baby's normal baseline, which is why personalization is so great, because with a personalized approach, we know baby's baseline, and that helps us make these decisions and know what's going on with baby from a personalized standpoint. Then if it's going down to that like lower place at the end of the contraction, and it takes a while to come back up, it's not coming up as quickly as we want it to be, then we're seeing like, okay, that's a sign baby's not tolerating labor well. And so all that means is that we need to either get mom in a different position, usually hands and knees, give mom more oxygen because baby needs more oxygen, or potentially transfer because baby's starting to show us that they're not doing well anymore. So that is why it is safe to birth out of hospital with the right monitoring with a licensed midwife if you're a low risk person. Low risk, the term varies depending on the provider, what makes you low risk and what makes you not. So if someone tells you you're high risk, if that person is not a midwife, it would be good to get a second opinion if you're not sure about that, from a provider who doesn't practice in that facility, because some facilities say that you are high risk because that's their policy to categorize someone as high risk if they have gestational diabetes. But a midwife will say if you're diet controlled, you're not high risk, you know? And so it's a totally different model of care with a different philosophy and a different approach. And I won't go too deep in all of those examples, but that is something to be aware of for sure. So let's talk about the pros and the cons of midwives and obstetricians. The pros of midwives is that, like I said, they have higher breastfeeding rates. And I think that's probably because they offer more postpartum support. So in the model of care at the hospital, you have your baby. You stay for at least 24 hours because they want to do the metabolic screen after 24 hours for the baby. And sometimes you stay longer than that, and then you go home. And then the only care that you get as the person who gave birth is a 6-week appointment to give you the okay for exercise and sex. And that is a fundamental failure. And that is one of the reasons why we have such high maternal mortality rates. Those high rates, part of that, the reason why those rates are high is because mothers commit suicide. And they do that because they are unsupported with their mental health, and they aren't getting personalized care, continuous check-ins. And this is why the midwifery model of care is going to change the world as it grows, and why I'm so passionate about it. Because in the midwifery model, after you have your baby, it's different for every midwife, but typically, and as a student midwife, this is what we did. The midwife will be with you for 4 hours or so after you have your baby. Then or if you're at the birth center, you'll go home around 4 hours. Then they'll come to your house at 24 hours. And then they'll come to your house every other day for that week. And then they'll come to your house at 2 weeks, and then at sometimes at 4 weeks also, and then at 6 weeks. Sometimes they skip the 4 week, and that really just depends on the midwife. I think they usually do for a first time mom, or if you're needing support, they'll come to the 4 weeks. So anyway, you get a ton of support of someone coming over to your house for the first 6 weeks, and they provide care for baby too. So if baby remains in the scope of their care, you don't have to take your baby to a pediatrician until you're out of the midwifery care, which is around 6 weeks postpartum. So it is a way, if you choose to have a midwife and to birth out of hospital, it is a way that you can support your postpartum recovery and get more care, more medical care, more mental health care. Midwives typically, this is why they're so loved. They aren't just there to like check on you and check your blood pressure and take your baby's vitals and then leave. They're there to like ask about your family and talk to your siblings and give a little bit of counseling, talk to you about your pelvic floor. I've seen midwives washing dishes. When I go to postpartum appointments, I take out their trash. I do things to serve them because it's a calling. You're being cared for by someone who has a calling to really support you and your family and has a client load to be able to give you more care and more support than you would get elsewhere. And that's one of the things about midwives that is so wonderful. Also, a midwife pro, they are more likely to provide evidence-based care in comparison to the care that you'd get at the hospital. So many people believe at the hospital, I get the best care, but that's not true. You get the best care where you feel and you believe you're getting the best care. So whatever provider makes you feel the most supportive and safe, and looking at like the reviews, looking at the intervention rates of that facility or that provider, all of that stuff, looking at the information and assessing how you're feeling, that is how you find the safest path for you. There is not one safest path for anybody because, like I already said, we found that for low risk families, birthing out of hospital or in hospital, there isn't a big difference in outcomes, except there are much higher rates of tearing and interventions and cesarean in the hospital group. It's really about choosing what makes you feel the most safe, because if you feel safe, then birth will work better than if you don't feel safe. In the midwifery model, since midwives aren't constrained by any sort of like profit oriented, liability oriented models of care, are more likely to implement current research and evidence immediately into the care that they offer you, instead of having to like continue on the old routines of the way we do things, doing routine cervical exams at the end of pregnancy, breaking people's water to speed up labor, inducing at 39 weeks, all these things that are routine in some hospitals that are not based in evidence, and evidence actually showing like the harms, illustrating the harms of these things. And it takes a long time for the culture to change in an entire facility and for the policy to change. So providers can't just be like, oh, breech vaginal birth is safe for low risk people and I have training on this and I want to offer it. They're going to experience a lot of political challenges. They're going to probably be fired if they try to do breech vaginal birth, or shamed by their coworkers, because it is not something that the policy or the culture supports, even though the evidence does. You're more likely to get the best evidence-based care from a midwife than you are at the hospital. That midwives are more likely to give you or to support you in having an unmedicated birth if that's what you want. If you don't want an unmedicated birth, and you planning to have an epidural, that's totally great. Being in a hospital and getting an epidural is totally okay if that's what you want to do. But if you want to have an unmedicated birth, you are more likely to have one if you birth with a midwife. And the reason why is because midwives are skilled in normal physiologic birth. They're skilled in unmedicated birth because that's how they were trained. Obstetricians are skilled in pathology and addressing pathology and the use of interventions. And that is great because sometimes we need that. But if you go in wanting an unmedicated birth with an obstetrician, it's important to just accept that that obstetrician, is likely to be limited in what they can offer you in having an unmedicated birth, because their only training and skill set and comfortability, also like what they are allowed to do, is within the medical model, which means if we want to induce labor, they can't offer you natural tools. They can only offer you medication. If you are wanting, if you're trying to cope with labor and you're having bad back pain, they can offer you an epidural. They can offer you IV opioids. Maybe depending on the OB, they'll give you some positioning changes or encourage you to take a shower, things like that. And some OBs won't have that knowledge or skill, but like sterile water injections for your low back into the skin that can help relieve back pain. The use of the rebozo, hot oil massage, water, being in the water. Like there are all these things that midwives are like, I have a list of 10 things. Let's try them all. Like they're with you and they can give you that support and help you to relieve that pain or cope through it. They can't offer the medications though, so that's where they're limited. If you need to transfer for a medication, then we transfer. But if you are out of hospital with a midwife and you want an unmedicated birth, you're statistically most likely to have that unmedicated birth with the midwife, because the midwife is someone who is with you all throughout your labor. So giving you continuous support in not only medically, but emotionally and physically too, to help you to cope with contractions using all of their wisdom and all of their skill. Speaking of skill, midwives are more likely to they have more skill to assess progress because they are looking at the whole picture and they're with you throughout this experience and they know you. In the OB model, they'll walk in and say hi here and there, but they're not going to spend very much time with you, or you might not even meet them or know them until they come in to deliver your baby, right? Like to catch your baby. Like in those models of care, in the midwifery one, you're getting continuous support all throughout labor. And with the OB model, you're getting whatever support the nurse gives you or whatever support you bring to your birth. And sometimes nurse and hospital staff gives you a lot of support and sometimes they don't. And we just don't know, if we don't know what provider you're going to get, what nurse you're going to get, unless you do know what provider you're going to get. But often we don't know because most OBs are on a rotation. So you're not getting that continuous support. Continuous support, from a doula is something that can totally help fill the gap. The only limitation that exists then is assessing progress clinically, because we use dilation and numbers and data to assess progress in the hospital. So for example, in that model of care, you get there and you're 3 centimeters dilated and they say you're not dilated enough, go home. And this just happened to a mother. If you saw the videos going viral on social media recently, I was a woman of color who said, I'm in active labor. And they said, well, you're not because your cervix is 3 centimeters, sent her home and she had her baby in the car 8 minutes later. Midwives typically know that dilation doesn't mean shit and that you can totally change dilation, very suddenly and have a baby quickly, or you could be at 9 for many hours. And, I've seen both of those happen and I'm sure midwives have too, but they are able to assess your progress because they're with you. So they know you, they know how you're coping with contractions. They know what your unique pattern is because the standard textbook 511 pattern isn't the same for everyone. Everyone has different patterns. And so they can assess how you're coping and what your sounds are and what you're doing and how things are changing that way. And there are other signs they can look for, like the purple line we get on our very low back before you're ready to push. Some midwives I know say, I don't need to do an exam to know that they're ready to push. I see the purple line, they start to get grunty and I know they're ready to push. But other providers require, like OBs, not require, but for their own assessment, I guess, require the numbers. And we know that that's not evidence-based and it's not the best approach because it's not a personalized approach. So there is a limitation there. Also with a midwife, you know your provider. And so you know the person who is going to be at your birth. You develop a relationship with them and you develop a nervous system capacity to feel safe in their presence. And this is very important because birth, like an animal in the wild, we can only birth where we feel safe. And so if you don't feel safe in the presence of your provider, and it takes a while for some people to feel like I'm comfortable being naked in front of you. I'm comfortable with you putting your fingers in my vagina. I'm comfortable with you delivering my baby, with you like holding the container of safety around this most vulnerable experience of my life. It takes some time to build that trust and that relationship. If you don't feel safe, your body will release stress hormones. Even if you tell your body, oh, it's fine, like I'm safe, like it doesn't matter because your body already had a startle or already felt like surprised by some machine or by some provider walking in that you didn't expect or you didn't know, or something they said. And that has blocked oxytocin, and now your labor is getting slower and taking longer, because we keep messing with the hormones, right? Instead of supporting you and feeling safe throughout labor. And so that's super, super important. So I think that summarizes well the pros of midwives. I'll share the pros of doctors. The first is that they can prescribe medications. Certified nurse midwives can prescribe medications in the US. Certified professional midwives who do home births, nurse midwives do home births too, but not as often. Professional midwives cannot, which means that if you need medications in pregnancy, they need to just collaborate with a doctor. Doctors also are advanced in the pathology, right? So they have tools to address true maternal pathology that midwives don't. But, midwives have their scope of practice, and they don't support, if they're a licensed midwife following the rules, they don't support high risk birth. They only support low risk births. These doctors, they care for everyone. So they can take care of low risk, they can take care of high risk, basically. That's everything that I wrote down for this. So that is, an illustration. I could talk about this for hours, but to give you just a foundational understanding of what the research has to say on the difference, helping us understand why we have fears around birth and around midwives, I think can be really helpful. And just kind of unpacking well, what if something goes wrong? If you were to ask, if you're curious about having a midwife, if you were to ask them, hey, what if something goes wrong? Have you had poor outcomes? What is your transfer rate? How does transfer look? When would you transfer? Having those conversations is really important. And I'm sure that you would find, maybe I'm not sure, but I can imagine if you're talking to a licensed midwife who practices in an evidence-based way, that they have not had poor outcomes, that they have an evidence-based transfer rate, which is around 15%, and that their clients have positive experiences and healthy outcomes. And that's because we're assessing beforehand if the person is a safe person before the birth, to be able to birth outside of the hospital. And then we can continue to assess all throughout labor to make sure that person is safe. Maybe I'll answer the question before we close, or respond to this, because I hear this often. My friend had an emergency C-section, and if she wasn't in the hospital, her and her baby would have died. What do you have to say to that, Victoria? People say that to me a lot. When I talk about the fact that I'm a student midwife, or what because my births were at home and why I chose that. And so my response to that is that it's interesting if you were to unpack those stories, and I have unpacked hundreds of those stories with moms over my 15 years of attending births. I found that typically what happens is that the mom is experiencing interventions that increase the risk for C-section, because they increase the risk for something going wrong suddenly. When we take Cytotec misoprostol, which is it's the abortion pill that is used to induce labor, because it can make your contractions start and make your cervix make changes. When taken orally, taken vaginally is safer and just makes your cervix make changes, but that increases the risk for uterine rupture and placental abruption and fetal distress. Pitocin increases the risk for fetal distress and is used very, very often in births in the hospital to augment labor and to start labor. 1/3 of moms are induced, and most of them are induced medically with Pitocin and misoprostol. So Pitocin and misoprostol coming with the risk of fetal distress makes a lot of sense. And, I know I've heard of so many stories where the mom, for example, this one story, went in and for an induction for a non-medically indicated reason, because the baby was getting big, and which is not a medical reason to induce baby, because we can't know for sure if a baby's getting big on ultrasound. But it was told to her baby was big and she needed an induction. So there was not that personalization or that informed decision-making process happening. She was just doing what she was told to do. Wasn't progressing because she wasn't ready to go into labor. So they broke her water. And then after that, she still wasn't progressing. And baby was kind of in a funny position. So they went in with their hand to try through the cervix into the uterus to grab the baby's head and manually try to rotate the baby so that the baby would be in a better position for progress to happen. Then they did internal monitoring and continuous exams. And then she got a really bad infection and started having seizures, and they rushed her to an emergency cesarean. And yeah, she would have died. But if they didn't do that emergency C-section, if she wasn't in the hospital. But who caused that infection, right? Why did that infection start in the first place? Because we broke her water. We did internal monitoring. We did continuous vaginal exams. We did manual manipulation of the baby, internally introducing bacteria. And, that's probably why she had an infection. Interventions are needed sometimes, but they can lead to the need for other interventions. But what I found, and I'll check this comment in just a second, what I found is that in the culture, there is not a lot of responsibility. I think it is very convenient to be able to do what we want to do, treat them the way we want to treat them, use different interventions and be hands-on and manipulate and not leave things alone very much, because that model of care is not very good at leaving things alone. It is a skill as a provider to sit on your hands and wait and trust the natural, normal physiology. And if you believe that birth is fundamentally flawed and needs intervention, then probably in your philosophy, you're going to intervene more. And intervening more does increase the risks of the interventions coming up. And many of those risks, maybe I'll say one of the risks, is the need for an emergency C-section from a lot of Pitocin or from misoprostol due to fetal distress. And so unpacking the stories typically can lead us back to seeing like, oh, it was caused by those interventions. We're creating a better culture for our children's children, a more empowering birth story for ourselves and for our families.